Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whenever you happen to be watching this video. You'll have to pardon me. My allergies have been acting up for quite a while now, so I will do my best to be clear. And so let's begin with our recap.
Silent night, holy night, all is calm.
Last week, we talked about Genesis chapter 22, otherwise known as the binding of Isaac or the sacrifice of Isaac. It's the famous episode in the scriptures where Abraham is called by God to offer his son Isaac. The key takeaway from that passage is that, in fact, that's not what God wanted Abraham to do. What God wanted was everything but the sacrifice. He wanted Abraham's obedience and Abraham's faith. And while this may seem strange to us, it is something that is consistent throughout the scriptures. We especially noted in the book of Jonah. God tells Jonah something, but Jonah understands it in a way that is almost opposite to how God said it. And from this, we understand that through the eyes of faith, we see God as who he is and not as who we think he is. And that's it for the recap.
Silent night, holy night, all is calm.
The video for today is going to be a little shorter than usual, and this is in part because my other videos have been longer and I've been debating on how best to present this topic. We're going to skip Genesis chapter 23, which is the death and the burial of Sarah, frankly, because I'm not quite sure what to do with it. But instead, I'd like to jump ahead to Genesis chapter 24, which is finding a bride for Isaac, or the story of how Abraham sends his servant to find Rebekah, and Rebekah returns and becomes Isaac's wife. Today's video will be broken up into two major parts. The second part, which will be the devotional, is going to talk a bit about Rebekah and how through women, the Lord moves his promise to humanity that there will come a promised child, one who will bring deliverance, one who will free us from the curse of sin, how he uses women to move that promise along. But what I'd like to focus on today is instead the lessons learned from a life of faith, which we find in this passage. So let's jump into this and let us begin with the text we're going to be looking at primarily for today. It's on your screen now. It's Genesis chapter 24, verses 1 to 9. And this is when Abraham is asking his servant to go get a wife for his son. Now Abraham was old, advanced in age, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in every way. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he owned, Please place your hand under my thigh, and I will make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live, but you will go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac. The servant said to him, Suppose the woman is not willing to follow me to this land. Should I take your son back to the land from where you came? Then Abraham said to him, Beware that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and who swore to me, saying, To your descendants I will give this land, he will send his angel before you, and you will take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this my oath. Only do not take my son back there. So the servant placed his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master, and swore to him concerning this matter. Now, the placing of hands under the thighs seems like perhaps a very intimate thing to do, and it is. It was an act of a covenant swearing or making a promise to another person. That's what this hand under the thigh means. The thigh does have a bit of special significance in the Bible, which we'll talk about later on when we reach the story of Jacob, where it shows up again. But that's not really what I want to focus on. I want to focus on what lesson Abraham himself learned from his life of faith. There's some obvious ones. You see that it says explicitly, "The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, who spoke to me and swore to me, saying, to your descendants I will give this land. He will send his angel before you." Abraham has learned that God is the God who keeps his promises, and that if Abraham's line is to continue, if his family is to continue in this land, God will provide success. God will go ahead of Abraham and ensure the favorability of whatever it is Abraham needs to get done that is connected to the promise. And this is where I want to make a bit of a detour before I get to the key lesson Abraham learns from his life, is this idea of the promise. The promise. Faith is a very difficult thing to net down. And it is true that throughout the Bible, God responds to people's faith, always positively. The Bible says in the New Testament, all things are yes. All things are yes. God answers yes to us. But he doesn't answer yes for those things that are our wants, and sometimes even for our needs. It seems that God doesn't answer yes. We don't get what we want just because we want it or just because we pray for it. The needs that God is referring to are the fulfillment of his promises in our life. Because the Lord himself is our portion. The Lord himself is our inheritance. He is our promised land, and heaven is our home. So everything we need to get there, everything we need to inherit that place, that is what God will provide. And that's what he's teaching through Abraham. Abraham, the inheritor of the promise that God has given, is not a materialistic promise. It is rather a spiritual promise and an allegory of what the Christian journey is like. And so from Abraham, we see that when it comes to things related to the promise, God will always provide. Our faith will never be left without a positive result because our faith is in God. Our faith is not in the things of this world, but our faith is in God. If we set our faith on riches, if we set our faith on things that are not the promise of God, things won't always work out. Abraham tried Hagar, that didn't work out. He tried Ishmael, that didn't work out. God has his own plan. He has his promise, and we need to pay attention to his promise. So I just want to say that quickly, that though the Bible speaks very positively about getting positive results in prayer, those positive results are always connected to prayers for the promise and a life lived in obedience to God, because obedience reveals the will of God.
Silent night, holy night, all is calm.
Anyways, now that little detour is over, I want to touch on briefly the life lesson that Abraham learned. The life lesson that Abraham learned. I'm going to throw it up. Verse 8. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath. Only do not take my son back there. If we want it perhaps very strongly, specifically, we can look at it in verse 6, where Abraham says much the same thing. Then Abraham said to him, beware that you do not take my son back there. Back there. Do not go back. Abraham's life is a story of continually progressing upwards, continually moving forwards. And there were probably times in Abraham's life where he wanted to look back. We see this in the story of Lot, Abraham's nephew. Lot's wife looked back. She didn't progress forward. It's very easy to look back at failures, to look back at regrets, to look back at how things could have been, or look back at the things that God took us out of and to want to return to them. You see, Abraham was expressing here such a strong, such a sharp sentiment, and one that would foreshadow the troubles of the people of Israel, the promised people in the promised land, for all their history. The great battle of faith is what Abraham is boiling down here. It's all about not looking back, keeping your eyes ahead, focused on where God's angel is going ahead of you, walking the path that God has cleared and not blazing our own path. Abraham identifies two key problems that will plague the nation of Israel. One, a desire for a different land. The Israelites wanted to return to Egypt. Numerous times they were kicked out of their land, even because of their lack of obedience to God. The problem of staying in the promised land is what Abraham hints at, and we can't remain in the promised land if we're always looking back to where we came from. The second thing Abraham notes is the influence of the people we bring into our lives. You see, Abraham said, if the woman will not go with him, if the woman will not follow Eliezer, or the servant, sorry, his name isn't specified, if the woman will not follow the journey of faith, then she can't come along. Isaac is not to go back to there. He's not to give up his faith for someone else. And this is what plagued the people of Israel. For other people, Solomon and his many wives, the nations around them committing idolatry, they often stumbled and fell into sin because they surrounded themselves with people who were living in sin and let them influence them and bring doubt into their life and into their mission. Abraham's lesson of not looking back is actually much more complicated than it appears. If we don't want to look back, we need to also lay aside every hindrance that encumbers us. Abraham had to make sure that the wife Isaac had in his life, the people in our lives, are good for our faith and are sharing the same faith, the same promise, the same promised land. And we also have to make sure that we're not regretting our inheritance, the heavenly kingdom, wanting to return to the earthly kingdom, where the prince of the air and the lord of this world reigns. The Christian is supposed to be free from those things. And that's the great lesson from Abraham's life of faith. There's many things we can take from it, but these two are the key things which I think Abraham has learned, and you see them as evidenced in his life story. He separates from Lot, his nephew, because his nephew Lot would not follow him. And also he learned to cling to the land that God had given him and not to leave just because things were hard and he didn't have what he wanted.
Silent night, holy night, all is calm.
And now I want to talk a bit about Rebecca. You know, the story here in Genesis 24 really shows Isaac as kind of a background role, Abraham in a background role, and the person that moves to the foreground, the person who through their faith, through their love of God, through their pursuit of the promise, the person who moves to the foreground is actually Rebecca. She is the one who steps out from her father's house. She is the one who goes forward. She is the one who does it. And so when she steps forward, she's actually participating in the promise that God gave to Eve. I'll throw it up there. Genesis 3:15, when sin first entered the world, the Lord said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, speaking of the devil and the woman, and between your seed, Satan's seed or his children, and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. There's this battle between the chosen seed, and Abraham is the one who's received the promise that his children, his offspring, are chosen of God. And it's not just some masculine patriarchal promise, but it's also a promise specifically geared to the chosen woman. Abraham couldn't just have children with whoever. It was the child from Sarah. That was the promised one. The woman was necessary to fulfill God's promise. The man and the woman could not be separated, equal heirs and inheritors of the promise. And in many ways, sometimes greater heirs of the promise. In the story of Isaac and Rebekah, Rebekah is the one who steps out, who claims the promise, and this is where we're introduced to her as the woman of promise. She is the one that the promised child will come from. From her, the promised child will come. No other wife, she is the special one. And that's important to see because that's going to show up a lot in the next few chapters. I'm going to point it out when it shows up, but I want our eyes to be open on that.
Silent night, holy night, all is calm.
Here's the final lesson we learn from the life of Abraham, which is that we are to occupy ourselves with claiming people for the promise. You can see in Abraham's household, he was not alone in believing in God and that God answers prayer in the promise of God. That servant prayed. That servant trusted in God as he saw Abraham do so. And Abraham specifically sent that servant to go get someone else and incorporate that someone else into the promise. We are to share God's promise that he gives to us. The Christian life is one that is meant to be shared. We're supposed to call people out of the world, call people out of what we left behind, and invite them to share and to walk with us in this promise God has for us. Abraham, in so many ways and in so many chapters, but especially in this one, is the perfect allegory, the perfect picture of what a Christian is supposed to do with their lives. It's so important. It is so important to not leave people behind. Jesus was all about not leaving people behind. And for the one he would go to any length to bring them back to his flock. And so we as Christians, seeing the example of Abraham and ultimately the example of Christ, we see that we are called to call people out. Because the only reason we share in this promise of God is because God called us. Not because of how amazing we are, but because he called. And so we too must call God's call, the call of the promise. And with that, we finish our short look at Genesis chapter 24. I know we didn't talk about marriage. We didn't really talk about finding a spouse because I don't actually really think that's what that chapter is about. But all that aside, next week we're going to wrap up Abraham's life completely, just very briefly, and then we're going to move on to the next part of the story. Thank you, and I'll see you guys next week.
It is finished, it is finished, tetelestai. The beauty of the double meaning phrase. He ceased from his labor, and so if I, now resting only in his grace. It is finished, tetelestai. The Son of Man succeeding where I failed. The wrath of God now satisfied in Jesus my Emmanuel. It is done. He's alive, and he is able to bring us life. In 3 days he will rise to tell